Hash the inheritance, that CHANGD everything. I'm sitting here in my apartment right now, the one that legally belongs to me as of 3 weeks ago, and I still can't believe I'm about to tell you this story. My hands are actually shaking as I think about where to even start. You know that feeling when your entire life gets turned upside down in a single moment? When everything you thought you knew about your family, about love, about forgiveness, just shatters like glass. Yeah, that's where I'm at right now. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 31 years old, and I just inherited my grandfather's apartment in Brooklyn. Sounds simple, right? Like, oh great, free real estate, problem solved. But here's the thing nobody tells you about inheritances. Sometimes they don't come as gifts. Sometimes they come as conditions. And sometimes those conditions force you to confront the most painful parts of your past. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story isn't really about an apartment at all. It's about a family that fell apart, a man who disappeared, and a little girl who never got answers. My grandfather, Robert Mitchell, was everything to me. He was the kind of man who remembered every detail about your life. He'd ask about your job, your friends, your dreams, and actually listen to the answer. He had this way of making you feel like you were the most important person in the world. My parents divorced when I was 7, and my mom remarried when I was 11. That's when everything started to get complicated. His name was David Hartley. He seemed perfect at first, like something out of a movie. He had this charming smile, you know, the kind that makes you trust someone immediately even though there's something in the back of your mind telling you to be careful. He brought my mom flowers. He took us out for ice cream. He made my mom laugh in a way I hadn't heard in years. And I remember thinking, okay, maybe this is going to be good. Maybe we're going to be a real family again. My grandfather didn't trust him immediately. I remember this one time when David was picking me up from school and Grandpa was there waiting too. He looked at David like he was trying to read his soul or something. Later, he pulled me aside and said, "Sarah, honey, people aren't always what they seem. Remember that." I was only 11 and I didn't really understand what he meant. I thought he was just being overprotective, but then came my 12th birthday, December 15th. That date is burned into my brain like a scar. I woke up that morning so excited. I was having a birthday party that afternoon, just a small thing at our house with some friends from school. My mom had baked my favorite cake, chocolate with raspberry filling. David had even helped decorate the living room with streamers and balloons. Everything felt perfect. I remember getting dressed and changing my outfit like 3 times because I wanted to look nice. I was that age where you start caring about how you look. You know, my mom said David had to run out to pick up something for the party. He said he'd be back in 20 minutes. That was at 10 in the morning. He never came back. I kept asking my mom where he was. The party started at 3 o'clock, and he still wasn't there. I could see the worry starting to creep into her face, the way her jaw would tighten every time someone asked about him. By 5 o'clock, she was calling his phone over and over. By 7 o'clock, she called the police, and here's the thing that made it even worse. He didn't just disappear. He disappeared with money, a lot of money. It turned out David had been stealing from my mom's business for months. He'd been opening credit cards in her name. He'd been lying about everything. His job, his background, his entire life was basically a carefully constructed lie. And on my 12th birthday, when everything was supposed to be perfect, he just vanished. The police never found him. Not really. They got a few leads over the years, but nothing concrete. It was like he evaporated into thin air, and I was left with this gaping wound that never quite healed. My mom went through this really dark period after that. She was angry, devastated, embarrassed. She'd cry in her room at night thinking I couldn't hear her. She started having trust issues with everyone. She basically closed herself off from the world. And I became angry too. Angry at David for hurting my mom, angry at myself for liking him, angry at the world for being so unfair. My grandfather was the one who held us together during that time. He'd come over constantly. He'd make us dinner, sit with my mom while she cried, and he'd spend time with me, making sure I knew that what happened wasn't my fault. He was like our anchor in the storm. Years went by. I grew up. I went to college, got a job in marketing, built a life for myself. My mom eventually healed and moved on, though she never quite trusted men the same way again. And I carried this weight with me, this anger that never fully went away. Grandpa got older. He had a stroke about 5 years ago that left him in a nursing home. I visited him every week. He'd tell me stories about his life, about my grandmother who passed before I was born, about the mistakes he'd made and the things he'd learned. And then, about 2 years ago, he seemed to shift into this phase where he kept talking about forgiveness. He'd say things like, "Sarah, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die." I'd roll my eyes because I was still so angry. He passed away last year, peacefully in his sleep. I was devastated. He was my rock, the one person who always understood me. The will was read 3 weeks ago. My mom got the house upstate where we spent summers. My uncle got some investments and money. And then there was me. I got the apartment in Brooklyn, this beautiful place with exposed brick and huge windows overlooking the street. The apartment I'd always dreamed about living in. But there was a condition written right there in the will, in my grandfather's handwriting. The lawyer read it out loud, and I felt my entire body go numb. It said, "To my granddaughter Sarah, I leave my apartment in Brooklyn. However, she will only receive full ownership and the right to live there permanently if she can find it in her heart to forgive David Hartley for the pain he caused our family. If she cannot do this by her 32nd birthday, the apartment will be donated to charity." I remember standing up so fast I knocked over my chair. I was shaking with anger. How could he do this to me? How could he ask me to forgive the man who destroyed my childhood, who hurt my mother so deeply? I felt betrayed by the one person I thought understood me completely. The lawyer gave me a packet of information that Grandpa had left with his will. Inside was a letter addressed to me and an address in New Mexico. That's where I found him. That's where David Hartley had been all these years. I didn't open the letter for 3 days. I just sat in my apartment, the one I couldn't fully claim, and stared at it. My best friend Jenna came over and I told her everything. She sat there with her mouth open the entire time, just processing what I was saying. When I finished, she said, "Okay, so what are you going to do?" And I honestly didn't know. I read Grandpa's letter on a Tuesday night. I made myself a cup of tea, sat on my couch, and opened it with shaking hands. His handwriting was a little shaky, probably written near the end of his life, but still so distinctly him. He wrote, "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And you're probably very angry with me, I understand. But I need to tell you something that I should have told you years ago. I know where David is. I've known for a long time. I've been in contact with him, and I've watched him struggle with what he did to your family. I've watched him try to rebuild his life, make amends, and find redemption. I'm not asking you to forgive him for him. I'm asking you to forgive him for you. Because, Sarah, the anger you're carrying is destroying you. I see it in your eyes every time you visit me. I hear it in your voice. And I know that you're too good, too beautiful, too full of potential to let one man's mistakes define your life. I've included his address because I think you need to hear his story. Not to excuse what he did, but to understand it. And maybe, just maybe, you'll find peace. I love you more than words can say. Grandpa." I cried so hard after reading that letter. I cried because he was right. I was angry all the time. I was suspicious of men. I had commitment issues because I was terrified of being betrayed. I had built this entire wall around my heart because of what David did, and I was the one suffering for it. The address he gave me was for a small town called Silver City, New Mexico. I looked it up. It's this quiet little place in the mountains. I spent a week just thinking about whether I should actually go. My mom thought I was crazy. She said, "Sarah, why would you want to see him? Why would you want to open that wound?" And I kept telling her, "I don't know, I just feel like I have to." I booked a flight for the following Friday. I was terrified the entire way there. I kept thinking about what I would say, what he would say, whether this was a huge mistake. I rented a car and drove to the address Grandpa had given me. It was a small house on the edge of town, kind of run down, with a garden out front that was actually pretty well maintained. I sat in my car for like 20 minutes before I got the courage to knock on the door. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. When he opened the door, I didn't recognize him at first. He was older, of course, but also different. He looked tired, worn down by life. His hair was graying, and his face had these deep lines around his eyes. He looked at me, and I watched the recognition wash over his face. He went completely pale. He said my name, just Sarah, like he couldn't quite believe I was standing there. And I felt this rush of emotion, this mix of anger and sadness and something else I couldn't quite name. I said, "Can we talk?" And he just nodded and stepped aside. His house was small and modest, nothing fancy. He had pictures on the wall, and I realized with a shock that some of them were of me. Old pictures from when I was little before everything fell apart. I felt my anger spike again. How dare he have pictures of me? We sat down in his living room, and there was this awful silence. He looked at me like I was a ghost, like he couldn't quite believe I was real. Finally, he said, "I don't know where to start. I don't know what to say to you." His voice was shaking. I said, "You could start with the truth. You could tell me why you did it, why you hurt my mom, why you hurt me." He took a deep breath, and then he told me everything. He told me about his childhood, about his father who was abusive and left him with all these issues about money and security. He told me about his addiction to gambling, something I never knew about. He said he'd gotten into debt with some really bad people, and he was desperate. He said when he met my mom, he genuinely cared about her, but the debt kept growing, and he didn't know how to get out of it. He said that on my birthday, the people he owed money to gave him an ultimatum. They said they'd hurt my mom and me if he didn't come up with the money. So he took it and ran. I listened to all of this, and I felt something shifting inside me. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe understanding. He was a broken person who made terrible choices. That didn't excuse what he did, but it made it human somehow. It made it less about me and my worth and more about his own struggles. He said, "I've spent 20 years trying to make up for what I did. I've been sober for 15 years. I've been in therapy. I've tried to find your mom to apologize, but she changed her number and moved. Your grandfather, he found me about 10 years ago. He gave me a chance to talk to him, to explain. And he told me about you, about how angry you were, and it broke my heart all over again." I asked him, "Why did Grandpa keep this from me? Why didn't he tell me where you were?" David said, "Because he wanted you to find me on your own terms. He said that if he just told you where I was, you might never come. But if he made it a condition of your inheritance, you'd have to face it. He knew you better than you know yourself, I think." I sat there for hours listening to David talk about his life, about his recovery, about the guilt he carried every single day. And I realized something profound. He had been suffering too, not in the same way I had, but suffering nonetheless. And Grandpa, wise Grandpa, knew that both of us needed this. He needed to face me in my anger, and I needed to face him in my pain. Before I left, I asked him, "Do you want forgiveness from me?" He said, "No, I don't deserve it. What I want is for you to be okay. What I want is for that anger to not consume you anymore." I drove back to my hotel that night, and I sat on the bed and just cried. Not angry tears, but cleansing tears. The kind that wash away something old and make space for something new. I spent 2 more days in Silver City. I visited David again, and we talked more. Not about the past, but about life. He told me about his job working with at-risk youth, helping them stay away from the mistakes he made. He told me about the community he'd built, the people he'd helped. He wasn't asking for absolution or for me to think he was a good person now. He was just living, trying to be better, trying to make amends in whatever small ways he could. On my last day there, he said something that stuck with me. He said, "Your grandfather told me that the greatest act of strength isn't holding on to anger. It's letting it go. He said you were strong enough to do that, even if you didn't believe it yourself." I came back to New York, and I did something I hadn't done in years. I let myself be vulnerable. I started dating again. I went to therapy to process everything. I started having conversations with my mom about David, and she told me things she'd never told me before. She said that she had actually forgiven him years ago, not for his sake, but for hers. She said holding on to the anger was keeping her stuck. The paperwork for the apartment came through last week. I officially own it now. I've been walking through these rooms, touching the walls, looking out the windows, and I feel this sense of peace that I haven't felt in so long. But here's the thing. The apartment isn't really what this is about. Grandpa knew that. He knew that if he just left me the apartment outright, I would live here, but I would still be carrying this weight. By making me face David, by making me choose forgiveness, he gave me something so much more valuable than real estate. He gave me freedom. I'm not saying I've completely forgiven David. Forgiveness isn't something that happens in one conversation or one visit. It's a process, something you have to choose every single day. But I've chosen to stop being angry. I've chosen to see him as a broken person who did terrible things, but also as a person who's trying to be better. And in doing that, I've freed myself. My relationship with my family is different now too. My mom and I are closer because we're not bonded by trauma anymore. We're bonded by understanding and compassion. My uncle called me after I got back and said he'd always known about David, that Grandpa had told him, and he respected my grandfather's wisdom in handling it the way he did. I think about Grandpa all the time now, and instead of just missing him, I feel grateful. Grateful that he loved me enough to push me toward healing, even when I didn't want to be healed. Grateful that he saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. Grateful that he understood that real love sometimes means making people uncomfortable so they can grow. The apartment is beautiful, and I love living here. But every time I look at the walls, every time I make coffee in the morning and stand by the window, I think about the condition that came with it. I think about my grandfather's wisdom. I think about forgiveness and what it really means. Forgiveness doesn't mean what David did was okay. It means I'm not going to let it destroy me anymore. It means I'm choosing to move forward instead of being stuck in the past. It means I'm giving myself permission to be happy. And you know what? That's worth more than any apartment. That's worth everything.